Thank you all for joining us and welcome to the first seminar in the seminar series. My name is Julia. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the Youth Resilience Unit. Um, we are a unit that is funded by the Barts charity, and we're part of the Wolfson Institute of Population Health at Queen Mary University in London. We're based at the New Centre for Mental Health at the moment. And the general kind of objective of the unit is to investigate different community resources that young people and children can use to overcome difficulties and increase their resilience. And so we're working with a lot of schools and a lot of mental health providers. So it's fantastic to see so many of you and such a good turnout for this seminar. Today, we're very excited to have Abby Thompson speaking, who is a second year PhD student at Queen Mary University at the Centre for Psychiatry and Mental Health. And her PhD is focusing on emotion regulation and investigating kind of potential mechanism underlying different mental health problems in adolescents. So very interesting stuff. I'm really excited to hear her talk.
Thank you, Julia, for that introduction. And yeah, thank you for having me today. I'm really happy to be here and share some of my research so far from my PhD, looking at emotion regulation in adolescents. So my background is in child and adolescent mental health research specifically. I actually started off looking at parental mental health and the impact of that on the child. And through that work, sort of became interested in preventative sort of interventions to support and kind of foster well-being in children. And one mechanism and one sort of prevention approach is through emotion regulation. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about today. So bit of an overview for the session. So I'll start off just by kind of defining what emotion regulation is and why it's important, in particular for adolescents and for mental health. And then I'm going to unpick a little bit in terms of the strategies and the skills that we use when we regulate our emotions, so that I can talk a little bit about approaches which we're kind of exploring and the evidence base in terms of support for emotion regulation in adolescents. I've tried to tailor a lot of what I'll talk about in terms of support, so thinking about what can be offered through schools as well. So I'll talk a little bit about how the strategies and the skills which are needed can be sort of provided or taught by teachers or in schools too. So before I even sort of talk about emotion regulation, I think it's important to just think about the importance of emotions in general. So emotions have a really significant role to play in our lives. I'm sure we all know this. They play a huge role in terms of guiding our kind of goals, decision making, how we understand and interpret situations, and kind of what we're motivated to do and to achieve. Emotions themselves, kind of individuals can have very different responses to the same or similar emotions. And I think that's important to consider when we look at emotion regulation. For example, a young person may feel stress around exam time. And while one young person might be able to kind of handle the demands of that emotion and use it in their favor and sort of use it to motivate them to study and to achieve academically. Another young person who struggles with stress around exam time might find that overwhelming. The intensity of that emotion may be stronger. The frequency of that emotion may kind of hinder their approach to studying rather than support it. So whilst emotions are there to kind of guide us, it's about the experience of an individual and how they cope with the intensity of that emotion and the frequency of it that is really what we're interested in understanding to sort of support young people. So emotion regulation itself is still very broadly defined within research and within the literature. But overall, we could sort of think about it as our ability to recognize, assess, and adjust your own emotions as they arise, particularly thinking about how they're experienced and how they're expressed. And we think of this process as kind of goal directed. So, what do you want to achieve, and how is the sort of experience and expression of your emotions helping you to achieve that goal or sort of preventing you from achieving that goal? And you can see from that definition that there's lots of different components to this process. And it's something that can evolve over time. There's things to consider in terms of the magnitude, the duration, behavioral responses, emotional kind of experiences. So it's very multifaceted and complex in that sense. So a lot of what I'll talk about today is kind of unpicking those different processes and thinking about at what point you can sort of intervene or change the way that you regulate an emotion. I think there's some important things to consider in terms of how emotion regulation works. A lot of the time we tend to think of emotion regulation as something that's unique to negative emotions. So for example, when we feel angry, maybe at work, we would kind of assess the situation and kind of down regulate that emotion given the context within which we're allowed to kind of express that anger. But it's also something we do with positive emotions as well. So kind of thinking about how we express happiness or excitement in different situations and how we regulate those emotions too. Secondly, I think it's important to note that the process of emotion regulation isn't always a conscious one. So we can also unconsciously regulate our emotions too. So for example, if we see something that's distressing, we can immediately look away from that without even thinking of it. So it's important to consider that as well. And then thirdly, the process of emotion regulation isn't inherently good or bad. And this is something which is quite important when thinking about support for emotion regulation, is that an approach that works for one person or for one particular situation might have the opposite effect in another situation or an individual. So it's quite nuanced in that way. So that being said, there are situations where a young person might struggle with an emotional experience. We've all had times where we don't respond perfectly in our lives because of our emotions. So we might have anger outbursts or lose our temper. Nobody's perfect, and especially in adolescence, when you're still developing these skills, it can be quite tricky to respond in a sort of healthy way to the different emotions you experience. That being said, what we're interested in and what tends to have the biggest impact on mental health specifically is when this happens frequently and intensely. So kind of thinking about a pattern of this emotional experience or activity that's interfering with goal-directed activity. So this can look different for different people again, but it may be that, for example, a young person might have problems calming down, or they might act impulsively, or they could struggle to identify and understand how they feel. And at the more extreme end of things is when we start to see things like self-harm or substance abuse in terms of managing distress. So even though it has these different, or it manifests in different ways, what we're really looking at is a pattern of kind of frequent and intense dysregulation, which is having an impact on well-being. And it can have a range of different consequences. So I think one of the most kind of obvious ones, and the one which I research primarily in my PhD, is the impact on mental health in adolescents. So I'll talk a little bit now about some of those consequences. So what I'm showing you here is essentially the development of emotion regulation throughout childhood and adolescence. And emotion regulation is unique in the fact that it develops over a very long period. So unlike things like language, which develop kind of early on in childhood, emotion regulation actually continues to develop up until around age 25. And what we see over time is that there is an improvement on average in terms of the approaches used, the understanding, the awareness of emotions, but around sort of middle adolescence, so looking specifically at age 12 to 15, there's almost kind of like a regression or a dip in terms of the skills used and the approach taken by young people. So more adolescents tend to engage in strategies that aren't helpful in managing their emotions and can exhibit kind of more signs of emotion dysregulation, specifically at that time point. And then if we look at sort of the peak onset of most common mental health problems, we see kind of an equal and opposite effect. So kind of caveating this by saying that there still needs to be a lot more research about which one comes first, and kind of the relationship between those two things. But I think what's interesting here is that at the core of what I'm showing you, that where emotion regulation starts to dip, we also see kind of the peak onset of mental health problems really rising. So around this sort of 12 to 15 age range. And that's been shown across a range of different studies. So for example, in adolescents, we found that emotion regulation problems have been associated with disorders such as anxiety and depression, ADHD, eating disorders, particularly in this age range. For example, anxiety, we tend to see a sort of lack of understanding of emotions and kind of engaging in strategies which maybe aren't helpful, such as avoiding situations or withdrawing from experiencing emotions. So it's really interesting that we have this mechanism and we see something that's so common across different disorders in terms of emotion regulation. But beyond just mental health, there's other consequences to consider for young people too. So around 60% of adolescents with one mental health problem also have another. And that's thought to be because they have shared symptoms or kind of similar underlying mechanisms across these different diagnoses. And emotion regulation is actually one mechanism that has been shown to be present across disorders. So it's kind of really contributing to kind of increasing distress in adolescents. In addition to that, it's been shown to be linked with behavioural problems. So there was a study that found that young people who struggled with emotion regulation, excuse me, at around age 6 or 7, went on to have sort of significant behavioural problems in secondary school. So we're seeing this sort of causal effect here with behaviour. In addition to that, there's an impact on kind of social outcomes, so peer relationships. So as a young person, if you're having increasingly kind of inappropriate emotional responses to situations, that can really negatively impact on your friendships and cause kind of social challenges for young people too. And then another sort of consequence is academic achievement. So it's been shown that there was a study that was done, and basically they provided a sort of educational workshop to young people on kind of the impacts of stress and how you can harness stress, for example, in a positive way. And in the other group, which they studied, they just kind of told them to ignore it and kind of not deal with it in that same way or regulate it in that same way. And actually those who understood a bit more about emotion regulation and applied those techniques performed significantly better on their exams than those who didn't. And then finally, kind of a note around life satisfaction. So all these things can have a huge impact on just general well-being and also life satisfaction in adolescents too. So what can we do to sort of help, given that emotion regulation has these impacts, and given that there's sort of this opportunity in adolescence or vulnerability. What can we do to sort of support young people? And so that's sort of what my PhD aims to look at. And so in order to kind of understand the evidence that we have and the interventions that we have to support young people, what I'm going to do is just unpick the process and the skills that are required for emotion regulation. And for first looking at different strategies and how an emotion might actually unfold. So what I'm showing you here is called the process model. And what this does is basically takes you through an emotional experience all the way from the situation over to kind of your attention to that situation, how you perceive it or how you appraise the situation, and then your response. So your kind of expression of that emotion and your kind of internal experience of that emotion too. And so there's different points along this process at which you can kind of mediate or moderate things. So the first is situation selection. So even before you're in the situation at which you're going to have an emotional experience, you can alter, you can just not show up. You know, for example, if you're anxious about a test, you might just not show up and then you're not going to feel anxious about the test. So thinking about selecting the different situations that you're putting yourself in is one sort of strategy that you might use to regulate your emotions. The second sort of strategy, and it's very similar, is actually situation modification. So this is when you're actually in an emotional situation and you modify that situation. So for example, you might get up and leave the room if you're in a conflict, and we'd say that that was situation modification. Next, looking at sort of attention. We have this strategy called attentional deployment. And what that means is just how you're directing your attention either towards the emotion and what's causing you to feel that way or away from it. And that's something which you can do during a situation. And then moving towards sort of your perception and your appraisal of an emotion, looking at cognitive change. And all this means is how you reappraise a situation to change its emotional significance. And then finally, if you think about the responses, so you can modulate your response. So you could change your behavior, you could change how you experience an emotion, kind of just altering how you would respond. And what interventions and strategies tend to do is they kind of split approaches into two sections. So first of all, they'll focus on everything that comes before that response, right? So the situation, your attention to it, and how you understand it. And then the second sort of part is focused just on the response and how you're responding to an emotion. But firstly, if I just sort of break down this first part. So there's different things you can do, essentially, or different things a young person can do before they even respond. So if we look at sort of problem solving here, so this process can be done to sort of help you navigate different difficult situations. So you might actually conclude that you don't want a certain person present during a conversation because in a previous situation, it led you to become quite activated and quite upset. And we say that that's problem solving that is modifying the situations that you're putting yourself in. Similarly, we see that some young people will avoid certain situations, and that can have an effect on the way that they regulate their emotions because it's changing what situations they're putting themselves in and how they're coping with different things. The second sort of area where interventions tend to focus is on attention. And I'm sure you've all kind of heard of mindfulness, and that's really where that approach focuses. It's about supporting young people to modify their attention to different emotions. Similarly, we see kind of distraction as a technique to kind of move attention away from an emotion. And then contrastingly, rumination is where you're kind of really focusing on an emotion and thinking about it all the time and processing it to the point where it's becoming quite distressing. And then sort of finally looking at appraisal. So this is kind of a similar process to attention, but with more kind of problem solving involved. So this acceptance process here is another thing which interventions tend to target, teaching young people to accept emotions as they arise without trying to change them, how like no emotion is inherently harmful, and kind of validating that experience. And then reappraisal as well is another big target. And so what this means is actually taking the time to pause and to think through a situation, control where you're putting your attention and balance different perspectives in order to kind of respond in a more adaptive way than perhaps you would have if you hadn't taken that time. And so moving to the kind of second part or the kind of second set of strategies. So acceptance and suppression are kind of the most common. So the biggest focus tends to be on this sort of yellow area here, but there are some interventions that focus on the response. And you can either kind of accept an emotion and respond in a way that's very accepting, or you can kind of suppress that emotion and kind of in the way that you experience an emotion, the way that you respond to that is to kind of push it down and to not kind of deal with it or recognize it. And all of these strategies can be are often kind of understood as kind of really helpful or harmful. And for a long time, researchers thought that some were more harmful than others. So, for example, suppression and rumination were kind of seen as more kind of harmful strategies. Things like problem solving and acceptance were seen as more helpful. But now we're sort of moving towards an understanding of the idea of sort of flexibility and kind of context dependence and how different strategies may be helpful for some people and other strategies might be helpful for others. If we think about mindfulness, for example, there was an emotion regulation study which showed that in boys, mindfulness was actually very harmful when they felt kind of upset or distressed. But in girls, it kind of had the opposite effect. It was really helpful. So it's really thinking about what works for that young person and giving them kind of a range of different options to sort of help them and support them with their emotions. So that takes me on to sort of what can you actually do to support the implementation of these strategies, and particularly in young people, and thinking about schools. So I'm sure that this is stuff, you know, that happens anyway across a lot of schools. But thinking about establishing relationships with students that value communication and honesty, so that pupils feel comfortable responding in a way that's authentic and feel validated to sort of practice different strategies in terms of regulating their emotions. Also thinking about kind of offering psychoeducation where you're teaching them about all these different strategies, teaching them about the different points at which you can moderate or change an emotional experience, and providing them really with a toolkit to sort of try and test out what works for them. So exploring situations where strategies might be less helpful and thinking about situations where certain strategies might be more helpful. And beyond just teachers and staff as well, peers can be a really important influence for emotion regulation in schools. So there was a study about attendance in schools, and it was found that sort of the higher the attendance, the more social interactions young people were having, and as a consequence, they were getting more opportunities to sort of practice different emotion regulation strategies in different situations, and subsequently became better in terms of regulating their emotions and more kind of adaptive across different situations. So I think the main thing is just to offer kind of a validating environment and kind of teach and share the different strategies that are available to young people. So as I said, the strategies which we kind of know are helpful or harmful for young people, there's now been a move towards understanding actually how we're using them. And there's a real focus on applying strategies flexibly rather than thinking about the types of different strategies you're using. So recent evidence has shown that the most flexible use of different strategies is more effective than, say, for example, using acceptance loads or using distraction or avoidance. But in order to do that and in order to engage in that process, adolescents require certain skills. So the next thing I'll talk about is a few of those skills and how you can sort of foster them in young people. So there are a range of sort of specific skills that are important to help young people, A, access the strategies which I've just talked about, B, use them, and C, kind of understand them. So one of the first is thinking about awareness and understanding of their own emotions, but also other people's emotions, particularly if we're thinking about the context and how important that is, and sort of interpreting, okay, what's the situation? How can I respond? Kind of developing an understanding of other people's emotions is really important. Secondly, having the ability to identify and also label your own emotions. So knowing when you feel sad, being able to articulate that to somebody is really important. Also, kind of interpreting bodily signals. So a lot of emotional experience happens in the body, and it's about kind of knowing what those signals mean for you. For example, when your heart beats really fast because you're excited for something, is that excitement for you, or is it anxiety? You know, one person might interpret that as them being nervous, another person might interpret it as them being excited. So it's about being able to tune into the different kind of bodily signals. Fourth is kind of thinking about emotion controllability. And what I mean by that is how much a young person thinks that they have the power to control their emotions. So teaching them all these strategies is great, but if they don't actually think that they have the ability to control them and to use the strategies, then they're not going to be implemented effectively. So it's about considering kind of where a young person is at, and kind of fostering the belief that they actually have the ability to kind of control their emotions and change them and turn them up and down. Also, kind of self-compassion is really important for emotion regulation. We don't always respond in the way that we would like to, but it's about reflecting on that in a compassionate way rather than in a way that actually serves to kind of tear you down in a way. So thinking about learning from experience rather than never approaching a situation again. And then, as I said, kind of using strategies in a flexible way. And it's really important that you employ these skills and use these skills. So, for example, if we think about the strategy of problem solving, you can't problem solve unless you have awareness for your emotions, for other people's emotions, unless you can kind of identify what emotion you are feeling, unless you kind of have an understanding of the situation. Self-compassion as well will help, and also belief that you can then, going forward, modify your emotion. So it's all really important in terms of kind of fostering positive emotion regulation. In terms of support within schools and support which we've kind of identified as effective, again, it kind of comes down to teaching these skills kind of as early as possible. A lot of this could sort of work nicely as sort of PSHE lessons, in the same way that we teach young people physical education, kind of teaching them emotional education too. And I know that a lot of this happens in schools already with the sort of social emotional learning curriculum. but thinking about kind of cost-effective and feasible ways to teach these skills to young people. You know, different young people will be coming with different levels of these skills and different knowledge about their emotions. And I think schools can provide a really nice environment to kind of develop and increase these skills. Another important thing which schools can do is sort of help with emotional vocabulary and awareness of emotions. This isn't always something that children get at home. So actually kind of naming emotions and helping them kind of be aware of when they're responding in a certain way because of an emotion that they're feeling is really important. There's a few programs I've listed here which are kind of evidence-based programs specifically aimed at schools. And these have been found to be really effective, specifically in terms of fostering these skills. So you might have heard of a few of them. The Paths program is specifically for primary schools, but it's based in the UK, Northern Ireland, and it teaches skills such as emotional awareness. I think it's kind of universal rather than targeted in that way. The second program, Super Skills for Life, is also a great program, but it's more targeted in its approach. So it's more kind of early intervention for young people who experience anxiety and depression, but it can also teach them skills which are also kind of indirectly important for emotion regulation, such as physical education, diet, sleep, kind of nutrition, things like that. And then Ruler as well is another program which is aimed at sort of teaching the skills and the strategies which I've talked about today. So throughout all this work and throughout my PhD, the sort of focus is to think about a way of offering support through schools in a way that is feasible, and sort of recognizing the current demand on schools to kind of do it all and to have, you know, all this academic pressure. Is there anything that we can do with the sort of limited resources and capacity that schools have to kind of offer an intervention to support emotion regulation in adolescents? And so kind of the focus of my PhD is on thinking about digital tools as sort of an engaging and cost-effective alternative to more kind of in-person group sort of support. So I've spent a lot of time looking at different digital tools which are out there and different digital interventions which exist. And there's not a lot. So we did a review of kind of all the different published evidence on digital interventions for young people. And specifically, we looked at self-directed interventions, so things like mobile apps. And we looked across the world, and there were only 5 that were out there. They all came from the US. And they were very different in terms of the approaches that they took to supporting emotion regulation. Most of them were mindfulness focused, and just a few of them, I think there was one that actually looked at the skills which I've talked about as well. And so there's definitely a lot of work that's needed to kind of develop the different tools which are out there, because there's not that much available for young people at the moment. There are kind of other interventions and apps available, but in terms of the evidence base, it's still quite small. So yeah, definitely more work to be done there. And that's actually where I'm going to plug my next study, which is where we're going to kind of try and develop that evidence base a bit more. So there's an app called Moon Mission. It was developed in Australia at Monash University, and it's been shown to be very effective in Australia at improving emotion regulation in young people, but it's yet to be tested in the UK. So we'll be running a study. We're recruiting at the moment, and we're looking to work with schools based in London, and particularly this age range of sort of year 7 to 9, and offer them this intervention, this app called Mood Mission, and also run a workshop or a sort of session in schools around some of the skills which I've talked about, and some of the strategies which I mentioned. So Mood Mission itself has kind of over 250 activities, and it's really there to let the young person choose what works for them and to try out different activities such as mindfulness, kind of physical education, journaling, there's problem solving tasks as well. And so we're really kind of looking to test that out in schools and see A, if it's effective, and B, if young people enjoy it and find it helpful. So yeah, if you are interested in sort of collaborating on that project, and then do get in touch with me. I'd be really happy to chat more about that. But in terms of sort of take-home messages for today, really just to stress, I guess, the importance of emotion regulation for adolescents, for their mental health. Also to kind of point out that there's lots of different strategies and skills that are required for healthy emotion regulation. And schools can sort of provide a really safe environment for adolescents to learn about those strategies and skills. And kind of foster positive well-being and sort of prevent mental health problems. And also thinking about kind of digital interventions and developing that area as sort of a potential way of extending care and support in a really engaging way. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. Yeah, any questions?
Thank you so much, Abby. This was really, really interesting. We have a couple of questions in the chat,
Yeah.
and we had a couple of questions about actually the differences in this mindfulness, which I also wanted to ask about, and the difference in boys and girls, and why mindfulness seemed to be harmful for boys, but quite positive for girls. And um, someone was also interested what else could be used if mindfulness for boys seems to not be really a good target.
Yeah, it was really interesting study actually. And so it was done, it was a digital intervention, and they offered mindfulness activities to young people aged kind of 9 to 11. And the kind of feedback they got from young people is that boys really didn't enjoy the mindfulness activities, particularly at times when they were angry or upset. And being forced to kind of do those during those kind of really activated periods of emotion made things worse. And in terms of alternatives, what's been suggested as kind of helpful is actually kind of positive activation, and that's something which is being researched only very recently. There's been kind of an increase in that, but thinking about rather than trying to calm emotions down, how can you activate them in a really positive way? So things like going for a run, for example, or taking like a really brisk walk. Sounds kind of counterintuitive, but like shouting really loudly as well, in kind of a controlled space where you have kind of the space to do that in an appropriate way. But yeah, in terms of that population specifically, physical activity and kind of positive activation were things which were suggested as more helpful than kind of mindfulness.
Someone was also asking earlier about what happens when you offer a strategy to a young person and they do not want to engage with it, or they're not able to bring themselves to do it, like, for example, breathing deeply. What should you do in that situation? I think you touched on that a little bit with kind of how flexible we need to be when we apply these strategies, but could you tell us a little bit more about it as well?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's partly about flexibility. I think one thing which I've seen in sort of the parent literature, so thinking about how parents can support emotion regulation, is there's been a real push to kind of like normalize that. It's okay. You can offer a strategy and it's okay if it's not always the right one. But it's about offering the strategy, having different tools available to use, that's most important. And actually the process of a young person problem solving by themselves and being able to understand that actually that's not the most appropriate thing for me during this time is actually a really good thing. So allowing them to have the space to not do something that they don't want to and find an alternative is actually really good emotion regulation. So yeah, trying to kind of encourage that. And I think the most important thing, like you said, is flexibility and just having a range of different options available.
Yeah, and please do email Abby or write to her on Twitter if you are interested in working together. Someone was also asking about your new study coming up, if this is only for the schools in London or if you're planning to collect data across the UK, perhaps.
Yeah, at the moment the focus is on London. Just it's a kind of practical challenge in terms of I want to be able to visit the schools. I'm based in London, so trying to think about where I can get to physically. But yeah, sort of depending on how far away it is and depending on how recruitment goes, it's not something that I'm necessarily closed off to exploring kind of beyond London. Yeah.
Donna's asking if you're focusing on mainstream schools only or special education needs settings will be considered as well within your study.
So we're focusing on mainstream schools primarily, but I am working with a couple of educational psychologists who work in special schools. Um, so yeah, it's not kind of limited to mainstream education.
If there's no other questions, I had a quick question about the sort of emotion regulation strategies that children start off with. And I guess that links a little bit to this kind of flexibility and also individual differences, I guess. But do you think it matters what children start off with to what strategies will be best for them specifically?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So another one of my studies will be looking at the development of different emotion regulation abilities over time. I think in terms of what children start off with, there's a lot of evidence that shows that that's very dependent on the parent and the environment in which they grow up in. Like co-regulation is so important as you sort of develop um, emotion regulation at the very, very beginning. You learn your strategies through the people around you. So how would your parent respond to anger, for example? Would you be validated when you're upset? Things like that. And that can kind of form the blueprint for how you then go on and sort of self-regulate as you grow up. So I think that's the why children come in at different stages. And we see that things like trauma and particularly abuse really impact emotion regulation massively. Um, so yeah, there's a lot to be said about kind of the foundation and co-regulation at an early age.
We did have another question about similar studies being done in primary school children because you've been mostly focusing on secondary schools.
Yeah, I mean, the study which I'll send over, which is about the kind of mindfulness in boys and girls, that came from a primary school, and I think um, there are studies out there that focus on primary. But the reason, yeah, I think the focus has moved towards adolescents maybe more so recently is because we see that dip or that vulnerability around that age. Some people have focused on kind of implementing school skills before that. And people like myself are looking at that as kind of a vulnerable period to modify and intervene. So yeah, I think primary school is a really important avenue and has kind of equal footing in terms of potentially teaching children about their emotions, helping them to label emotions, helping them to name emotions, helping them to kind of develop the skills that I mentioned in terms of awareness of emotions too. Um, so yeah, it's definitely an important time, I'd say.
Yeah, that is a really interesting kind of element for primary schools as well. We're currently running a longitudinal cohort study in schools in East London. And one of the measures that we're collecting is emotional regulation. So it'd be really interesting to see what the differences are and sort of how perhaps community resources are linking to different strategies, how a family environment links to that and how that also links to mental health. So it's
Mm.
definitely really interesting stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I think there are no more questions for now. So thank you so much again, Abby. So yeah, thank you so much, and hopefully we'll see you at the next one.
Thank you very much.